Greetings, History 151ers. This is your planned lecture for originally scheduled for Monday, April 16th. We are not going to be holding class that day because I'm going to be out of state. So instead, this is a online lecture on the history of slavery, specifically in the South. And so today we're going to talk about and outline some of the broad contours of the history of slavery, how slavery developed, why white Southerners became slaveholders, and how slaves themselves coped and resisted to the institution of slavery. But before we begin, let's turn to our old friend Frederick Douglass. In July of 1852, Frederick Douglass was a free man living in Rochester, New York, which then was one of the epicenters of abolitionist thought and activity. By 1852, Douglass is maybe the most famous and influential African American in the United States, a fervent abolitionist, and a supporter of numerous other reforms, including women's rights. Now, on July 4th of 1852, he stood in front of a crowd in Rochester to talk about the 4th of July and what it meant to Black Americans. This was a picture of him taken around the time, so he probably looked a lot like this in 1852 when he gave this speech. And he asked his audience, what is the 4th of July to the African American? And he answered, quote, I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. End quote. So Douglass was not mincing words, as he never did. He was born sometime in the 1830s or 40s in Maryland, as you know, which was then a slave state, and by the time he was born, the institution of slavery had undergone radical changes. By the 1790s, it looked like slavery was going to die out, and indeed many founding fathers, like Jefferson and Washington, themselves slaveholders, hoped that it would. Until a Connecticut Yankee named Eli Whitney, pictured here on the right, made what would turn out to be an infamous invention. He didn't invent, but he perfected an existing model of an engine, which became known as a cotton gin. It was a hand-cranked engine which made harvesting cotton much quicker and easier. And cotton quickly became the primary export of the American South and the backbone of the American economy in the first half of the 19th century. All of America's economy and growth was virtually built on cotton and built on the backs of slaves. In 1801, the United States was producing 9% of the world's cotton. By 1850, 68% of the world's cotton came from the United States. And by 1860, 75% of the world's cotton came from the United States, most of it from the American South. But Eli Whitney's cotton gin was not the only reason slavery grew at exponential rates and the cotton economy with it in the 19th century. The other reason was a massive land boom. As we read last week, in the 1820s and 30s, the United States, particularly led by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, forced Native American tribes off of their tribal lands in what is now the southeastern states such as Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Southern planters moved onto those lands, and they took their slaves with them, and they began to grow cotton in huge numbers. The Cherokees, who, as we read last week, had revamped their society to model white society, appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court announced that they sided with the Cherokees, but Jackson ignored the decision. This land boom opened up huge amounts of land for sale. And indeed, the land sales skyrocket in the wake of Indian removal. In 1812, for instance, the U.S. sold 350,000 acres that year. 3 years later, they sold 1 million acres. 3 years after that, they sold 2.5 million acres. And cotton production skyrockets with it. The Deep South became heavily invested in cotton, rice, sugar, and human beings. In 1836, the value of cotton exports exceeded $71 million, and it was only exceeded by the value of slaves themselves. The value of slaves, enslaved human beings, exceeded $1 billion. It was more valuable than all of the infrastructure, banks, and roads of the South combined. Deep South planters used slaves not only for labor, but as liquid cash. Slaves were a walking, living, breathing capital. Slaves were sold to pay off debts, to purchase more land or material. They were used as collateral for loans, often to buy more slaves and land. In 1836, Frederick Norcom wrote a friend, James C. Johnston, about what was happening in old Indian country. He wrote his friend Johnston, quote, "All the lands obtained from the Choctaw Indians in 1832 have now been offered for sale. The greater part of the choice land, of course, was taken up the first year or two, and that now sells from 50 to 75 to 100 per acre, according to location. And on that land, Frederick Norcom noted that the demand for specie and property and slaves was more than he'd ever seen. Quote, "I know of no point in the world with 4 times its population which sells so many goods. Negroes and provisions and etc., and if things go on at this rate long, we must soon have 20,000 population. Goods are lying here in store in quantities, waiting for stores to be built, and all species of houses are going up as if by magic weekly. Property bought in the edge of town 12 months since for 200 per acre sold for 4,000 per acre last week. All species of labor here cost 3 times as much as at Edenton, and as a general rule, most everything cost about 4 times as much as in the old states, except Negroes. Prime man and woman together sell for 2,000. The ordinary mode of selling here is man and wife." End quote. And a huge population shift occurs from the 1830s to the 1860s as white planters begin to move to the southeast to plant cotton, and they brought their slaves with them. Here is a map of enslaved populations of 1790 juxtaposed with that of 1860. The redder the territory the higher percentage of enslaved peoples in that area. And as you can see, in 1790, enslaved populations were mostly limited to the Chesapeake region of Virginia growing cotton and the coast of South Carolina and Georgia presumably growing sugar and rice. By the 1860s, the enslaved population still exists in Tidewater, Chesapeake, Virginia, but it shifted precipitously to what becomes known as the Cotton Belt of the Deep South, through South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and along the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans. South Carolina by 1860 had a majority population of enslaved people. 60% of South Carolina's population was enslaved. And slavery in the Deep South becomes a different animal than in the Upper South. The work was harder, the punishment was harsher, the system was more oppressive. And to make their slaves more productive, planters set goals for each of their slave pickers. They had to meet a certain amount of cotton picked every day, and if they did not meet that amount, they would be punished, usually with physical punishment. After picking every day, slaves would all gather to weigh their cotton, and those that did not meet the quotas were punished. On many plantations as well, enslavers set a series of rules that were harsh and rigorous. One such source comes from Bennett Barrow, who was a planter in the Florida parishes of Louisiana, and in his diary from the 1830s and the 1840s, he left us a series of rules he set for his plantation. Some of the rules are as follows, quote, "No Negro shall leave the place at any time without my permission. No Negro shall be allowed to marry out of the plantation. No Negro shall be allowed to sell anything without my express permission. I have ever maintained the doctrine that my Negroes have no time whatever, that they are always liable to my call without questioning for a moment the propriety of it. I adhere to this on the grounds of expediency and right. The very security of the plantation requires that a general and uniform control over the people of it should be exercised, who are to protect the plantation from the intrusions of ill-designed persons when everybody is abroad. Allow it to be understood by a Negro that he is to provide for himself, and you that moment give him an undeniable claim on you for a portion of his time to make this provision. And should you from necessity or any other cause encroach upon his time, disappointment and discontent are seriously felt." End quote. Bennett Barrow considered himself a liberal slave owner. But the rules that he put forth illustrated that even the most well-intentioned slave owner claimed complete authority over the lives of their slaves. And the rules also revealed planters' fears about disobedience and resistance among their slaves. This again is a map that demonstrates the primacy of cotton in the agricultural economy of the South. As you can see, the broadest swath of land devoted to crops is devoted to cotton, second only to tobacco and followed by rice and sugar. In 1808, the Atlantic slave trade was ended by Congress, so no more slaves can be imported from Africa following 1808. In response, the South created an interstate slave trade to move slave bodies from the Upper South to the Lower South. A whole industry was created to buy and sell human beings between the states. More than 500 slaves were forcibly migrated from the Upper South to the Deep South as part of this interstate slave trade. and the epicenter of this interstate slave trade was New Orleans. New Orleans became the largest slave market in the United States. 250,000 slaves, we estimate, went to New Orleans, were put on the auction block, and were sold and sent away. Among these, probably about a third of slave marriages and families were broken up by sale. Slave traders bought slaves in Virginia for an average of $300 to $400 each, chained them together in what was called a coffle, and then marched them south. Along the way, slaves were sold to interested buyers who came across the coffle. The rest were marched to New Orleans, where there they sold for an average of $800 to $1,200. Solomon Northup was a free African American from the North who was kidnapped and sold into slavery, where he labored for 12 years enslaved, which became the title of his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which has recently been made into a movie, a fabulous movie, by the way. And Northup gives us a very descriptive and terrifying description of slave markets that many slaves might have found themselves in during this period. Solomon writes, quote, "Next day, many customers called to examine Freeman's new lot. The latter gentleman was very loquacious, dwelling at much length upon our several good points and qualities. He would make us hold up our heads, walk briskly back and forth, while customers would feel of our hands and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase. Sometimes a man or woman was taken back to the small house in the yard, stripped, and inspected more minutely. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his sale." End quote. And these markets were almost like, essentially, markets like animals were sold in, and slaves were treated much like animals, bought and given a price based on their supposed qualities, like a horse or a cattle or a pig. Slavery shaped the South. It was a gateway to money and power. If a Southerner wanted to be wealthy, almost as a prerequisite, he had to buy slaves. If a Southerner wanted to get into politics, he had to own slaves. Almost all of the politicians in the South were slaveholders, and slaveholder crossed all professional boundaries. Doctors owned slaves. Preachers owned slaves. But despite the prevalence and power of the institution, the majority of Southerners were not slaveholders. On the eve of the Civil War in 1860, 75% of white Southerners did not own slaves. Most were what historians call yeoman farmers. They were poor, self-supporting farmers who lived lives of economic self-sufficiency. Yet many of them in 1860, not all, but many, enlisted to fight a war to support the institution of slavery. And the question historians have asked is why? Why did white Southerners, most of whom did not benefit from the institution economically, support slavery? Well, there's several reasons why. The first is kinship ties. Most white Southerners were often related to someone who owned slaves. They knew people who owned slaves. This was part of life, and it became normalized for many white Southerners because of kinship ties. This became a normal practice for many of them. Economic opportunity was another. Buying slaves represented success and moving up the economic ladder. Many people saw slaveholding as a status symbol, like wearing Nike shoes today or having an Apple Watch. People went into debt to get slaves as a status symbol in the white South. Third was simply racism. Most whites, and certainly most Southern whites, believed that at the very least, African Americans were inferior to whites, and at the worst, they deserved the condition of slavery, and it was a natural, deserved condition. And this strong racism infected the white South, justifying the system of slavery based on beliefs of racial inferiority, incorrect beliefs that I hope that we all share. Finally, more recently, historians have argued that the support for slavery can be described as something called Ehrenvolk democracy. Ehrenvolk democracy comes from the Second World War. Ehrenvolk is a German word, and it describes a system of government in which the ethnic majority thinks of themselves as the master race and disenfranchises the ethnic minority. This is, of course, what happened in Nazi Germany. Christian white Germans believed themselves the quote-unquote Aryan master race, and they disenfranchised ethnic minorities and supposed inferiors, including Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, anyone they viewed as inferior. The same sort of system happens in the South. Ehrenvolk democracy united white Southerners while muting their class differences. They were united in the belief that they were the superior race, and they claimed for themselves all the trappings of power. The remaining 25% of the white South that owned slaves were not all equal. In 1850, a majority of slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer slaves. These were known as small slaveholders. Planters was a title that historians have given to the 40,000 families in 1850 who owned 20 or more slaves. And 20 enslaved people seems to be the tipping point of intense privilege that owning slaves brought. The ultra planters controlled the most fertile land, enjoyed the highest incomes, and dominated state and local offices in the leadership of both political parties. They were the 1%, the Koch brothers of the pre-war antebellum American South. And in response to the abolitionist challenge of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, which criticized slavery as being morally wrong, slaveholders began to respond with arguments in favor of slavery. They began to argue that slavery was right and morally justified. This becomes a noted shift from the previous generation, like Jefferson and Washington, who were slaveholders but argued that it was morally wrong and needed to end. By the 1830s, white Southern slaveholders are beginning to argue that slavery is right and natural and a good condition for both the slaveholder and the enslaved. An example of this comes from an article from DuBose Review, which was a popular and influential Southern magazine published in the antebellum South. And in the review, they dealt with the biblical challenge of slavery, saying, quote, "The anti-slavery party maintain that the Bible teaches nothing directly upon the subject, but that it establishes rules and principles of action from which they infer that in holding slaves we are guilty of a moral wrong." The editor went on to write, quote, "From the earliest period of our time down to the present moment, slavery has existed in some form or under some name in almost every country of the globe. Would this have been the case had it been wrong in itself? Would not someone of the host of sacred writers have spoken of this alleged crime in such terms as to show, in a manner not to be misunderstood, that God wished all men to be equal? Abraham, the chosen servant of God, had his bondservants, whose condition was similar to, or worse than that of our slaves. He considered them as his property, to be bought and sold as any other property which he owned. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 13, 23, and 27, we are told that God commanded Abraham to circumcise all his bondservants, quote, bought with his money. And Abraham obeyed God's commandment on this same day. In Genesis chapter 20, verse 14, we are told that Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them to Abraham. In chapter 12, verse 14, we are told that Abraham possessed sheep and oxen, and he assesses, and men servants and maid servants, and she assesses, and camels. End quote. All of this was beginning to be an example of slaveholders trying to justify the institution of slavery. What was the experience of slavery like? The everyday grind of slavery was labor. Men were primarily laborers, although most women were laborers as well. We think that about 90% of men were laborers, while probably about 75% of women were laborers as well. Slavery was difficult for everyone, but especially for enslaved women. Many slave women performed hard labor just like men, endured intense, cruel punishments just like men. But in addition to all that, especially for beautiful young enslaved women, they were almost always in danger of sexual harassment and assault. Most slaves worked 6 days a week from sunup to sundown. They got New Year's and Christmas off from work, but that was it. Most were pickers, tilling the soil, planting the seeds, nurturing the plant, and then harvesting the cotton or tobacco when harvest came. Picking was hard, tough work. Harvest season was in the summer, so slaves were working in the humid southern sun harvesting cotton. Every slave had a quota on most plantations, and those that did not meet their quotas were punished with physical force. Slaves were often allowed to marry and have families, although these weren't unions that were recognized by the law. They were only socially recognized on plantations, and slaveholders were bound by no law to keep families together. Slave marriages, historians have argued, were probably more egalitarian than marriages among white Americans. Slave husbands and wives were more on an equal level than their white counterparts. They both labored and they both shared in the raising of children, which was not the case for white American families. The greatest fear, more than the threat of violence for enslaved people, was the threat of sale. A third of enslaved families and marriages were broken up by sale, and it was the sale or the threat of sale that was the greatest fear of enslaved peoples. Again, we turn to Solomon Northup, who gives a description, a heart-rending description, of one slave family broken up by sale at a slave auction in New Orleans. That enslaved family was Eliza and her young child, Randall. Randall was purchased by a slaveholder from Baton Rouge, and Northup gives us this description. Quote, "The same man also purchased Randall. The little fellow was made to jump and run across the floor and perform many other feats, exhibiting his activity and condition. All the time the trade was going on, Eliza was crying aloud and wringing her hands. She besought the man not to buy him unless he also bought herself and Emily. She promised, in that case, to be the most faithful slave that ever lived. The man answered that he could not afford it, and then Eliza burst into a paroxysm of grief, weeping plaintively. Freeman turned round to her savagely with the whip in his uplifted hand, ordering her to stop the noise, or he would flog her. He would not have such work, such sniveling, and unless she ceased that minute, he would take her to the yard and give her 100 lashes. Yes, he would take the nonsense out of her pretty quick. If he didn't, might he be damned. Eliza shrunk before him and tried to wipe away her tears, but it was all in vain. She wanted to be with her children, she said, the little time she had to live. End quote. And that is a heartbreaking description that is also captured in the movie 12 Years a Slave, almost to a T of Northup's description. Slaves that were torn from their families and taken away to new places were alone and isolated and had to pick up the pieces and start a new life. And many slaves did this. They were torn from mothers and fathers, from brothers and sisters, from husbands and wives, from children. And they started again. And it was in this perseverance that they could demonstrate their humanity. They could demonstrate that they were human beings. Take, for instance, the story of Joe Kilpatrick. Joe Kilpatrick grew up an enslaved African American in North Carolina. He married and had 2 daughters named Lettice and Nellie. In the 1830s, a slave trader passing through North Carolina bought Joe from his master and tore him away from his family. He was marched with a coffle down south to Florida, where he was sold in Tallahassee. In the 1840 census, Joe Kilpatrick can be found living in a cabin he built on his master's plantation, and with him was a 5-year-old named George Jones. George Jones was likely an orphan, torn from his family and sold to a new master, and likely Kilpatrick took him in and raised him as his son. Jones lived with Kilpatrick until the end of the Civil War. During the time as well, Kilpatrick also got married again, and he had 2 more daughters, which he named Lettice and Nellie, probably in remembrance of the daughters he'd been torn from in the 1830s by a slave trader. And it was in this act to persevere and continue, to adopt an orphan child, to start another family, to remember their previous family they'd been torn from, that many slaves found a modicum of happiness and transcendence through small acts of kindness. Slaves could demonstrate their humanity by being moral human beings amidst all the hell of slavery. Which leads us, I missed a whole bunch of slides, which leads us to how did slaves cope with life under the tyranny of slavery? Slaves turned to a variety of coping mechanisms. First was kinship, like Joe Kilpatrick, creating kin networks on enslaved plantations helped slaves cope with the institution of slavery. But slaves like Joe Kilpatrick also practiced and created what historians have called fictive kin, relationships in family that didn't have blood ties but were nonetheless as powerful as real blood family. A modern-day example of fictive kin might be adopted children. Adoptive children are not not blood relatives, but they're nonetheless fictive kin. People create these networks, these powerful kin networks that are just as powerful as blood ties. Another coping mechanism slaves used was music. Music became a major way to cope and bond over the trials and tribulations of slavery. The music created on plantations in Spartanburg, in Milledgeville, and Natchez became intensely influential. Enslaved music created more space for improvisation, and many music historians trace that the blues and jazz emerge out of the slave tradition of improvisation. Slaves coped through religion. Religious meetings were popular among enslaved communities. Many masters forced slaves to attend church, where they emphasized the gospel of Paul. Paul had emphasized that slaves should be loyal to their masters and they would be rewarded. But privately, often slave communities held private, secret religious meetings, where they emphasized Exodus, where Moses led the Jews out of slavery in Egypt. This became a popular story, biblical story, among the enslaved community. Religion held the promise of justice and eternal peace after the mortal coil was snapped, a reckoning of this terrible system of slavery in another world. And finally, slaves coped with resistance. Resistance took many forms. Slaves resisted not only violently, but they resisted in smaller, safer ways. In the 1820s and 30s, historians looking back at the system of slavery often sided with slave owners, who typically in their diaries and letters described enslaved peoples as lazy and poor workers. They were constantly sick, they were breaking tools, they were working slowly. This seemed to be evidence of their laziness and their inability of independence. And historians agreed with many of the slaveholders. But later historians, starting with W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1930s and continuing through the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, began to reinterpret these sources. And rather than seeing enslaved people as lazy or incapable of independence, they saw them resisting in small and safe ways. Slaves could safely resist the system of slavery by slowing down the means of production. They understood that they were cogs in an economic system to make money for the slaveholder. And however much they slowed down that system, they could deprive the slaveholder of just a little bit of money. This was a small, safe act of resistance, and often slaves did this by pretending to be ill, by breaking tools, by hurting or killing draft animals, and by working slowly. Other slaves resisted by running away. And running away was a dangerous form of resistance, but one that was not uncommon. Historians estimate that probably about 1,000 slaves ran away annually, which might not sound like much, but if we consider how dangerous this act was, it's pretty shocking that 1,000 enslaved peoples typically would run away every year. And to assist runaway slaves could turn to the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad I do not like the name because it's kind of a misleading name and students often believe that it's an actual railroad. It's not. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad. Instead, what it was an informal network, a series of safe houses and places to get safe information for runaway slaves that would assist them as they ran away to freedom. The endpoints were cities close to the Canadian border: Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, and Augusta. Canada abolished slavery as part of the United Kingdom. So slaves could move to these cities or move to Canada through escaping and seek a modicum of freedom. One such slave that did this was pardon me, I've lost my place, was Joseph Tapper. Joseph Tapper was an enslaved man in Frederick County, Virginia, who in 1837 ran away first to Pennsylvania with his wife and children, and 2 years later fled to Canada. In 1840, Tapper wrote to a white acquaintance in Virginia recounting some of his experience. He wrote, quote, "Since I've been in the Queen's dominions, I've been well contented. Yes, well contented for sure. Man is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man in the image of God on level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? Would that the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with the bar of iron and the point of a diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free." End quote. And finally, slaves seeking the most extreme form of resistance would turn to violence. Violence was rare in American slavery, probably because plantations were often spread out. Most of Southern planters and Southern slave owners were on rural plantations. They had little contact with other neighbors and other enslaved peoples. Whites controlled access to firearms and supplies needed for a rebellion, and in this way slaves could not plan or organize a large-scale rebellion. But nonetheless, rebellions or near rebellions did happen. These are the 4 most notable or successful forms and examples of violent resistance against the institution of slavery: Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, the New Orleans Slave Rebellion, Denmark Vesey's plot, and Nat Turner's rebellion. In 1800, Richmond enslaved blacksmith Gabriel Prosser organized a slave rebellion to march on Richmond that would kill white inhabitants, capture the governor, hold him hostage until their demand for abolition was met. The plot was discovered by whites, and Gabriel Prosser, along with 26 of his other black co-conspirators, were executed. In 1811, between 200 and 500 slaves armed with knives, axes, clubs, and a few guns marched toward the city of New Orleans. Within 2 days, Louisiana militia fought the rebellion and crushed the slaves before they could burn New Orleans to the ground. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free African-American slave who was a carpenter, planned to lead a revolt against whites in the city. But like Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, his plot was discovered, and Vesey, along with 35 others, were executed. And the most successful and famous of these rebellions was Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was an enslaved preacher from Southampton County, Virginia, who came to believe that God had chosen him to free slaves. On August 22, 1831, Turner and a handful of followers marched from farm to farm, killing every white inhabitant they came across. Most of their victims were white women and children. The white Virginia militia organized put down Turner's rebels, but not before they had killed over 60 whites. Turner's rebellion sent shock waves throughout the South. DeBow's Review wrote, quote, "A Nat Turner might be in any family," end quote. The South went into a mass panic. In the aftermath, hundreds of slaves were beaten and tortured. Virginians thought about ending slavery and banishing blacks from the state, but instead the Virginia legislature tightened slavery. New laws, for instance, were passed that prohibited slaves from being preachers or even being taught how to read. Thus ends our exploration into the institution of slavery. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was informative. Please feel free to contact me with any questions you might have. And we will see all of y'all on Wednesday the 18th. Have a wonderful weekend.